Our next speaker is Kevin DeYoung. He is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte and also Senior Pastor of Christ Covenant Church in Matthews, North Carolina. He received his PhD in Early Modern History at University of Leicester, and his dissertation on John Witherspoon was published in 2020 by Routledge as a book, The Religious Formation of John Witherspoon, Calvinism, Evangelicalism, and the Scottish Enlightenment. I've heard from all different kinds of people that Kevin DeYoung is kind of a world expert on John Witherspoon, so I was incredibly grateful that he was willing to join us today and share some of his thoughts with us on this question.
Thank you. Certainly not a world expert, but it is amazing. I have a bunch of kids, and you can ask them. They are tired of hearing about John Witherspoon. And lots of PhDs in this room, if somebody out there in the world wants to know something about the 6-7 years you thought might have been a waste, you will travel. Have Witherspoon will travel. So thank you for having me. It speaks very well to Princeton that you would have this level of discussion and debate about one of the founders of our country, one of the founders of this university in a profound way, which I hope to get into. One of his later nicknames, Scotch Granite, perhaps is somewhat ironic given the imposing nature of his statue. I don't know that it's granite, but it does say something to how he was viewed even shortly after his own lifetime, as one who was a firm disciplinarian in the school, but also well-revered and well-respected in many different pursuits of life. I will get to the slavery question, since that is largely what prompts this symposium, but I do want to give you something of a sense of the man, John Witherspoon. Like so many in that founding generation, he had various avenues and, amazingly, accomplished a great deal in many different aspects of his life. So we are right to remember him as an important Christian pastor. He was, as one of the questions indicated, he was a leader of the Popular Party, capital P, that was to set it apart from the moderate wing of the Kirk, the Scottish Church. In the 18th century, you can think of it sort of shorthand as the evangelical wing of the Church of Scotland. He wrote best-selling books on ecclesiastical matters. He pastored a large growing church in Paisley, which was a booming textile. I left my tie in my bag, and it had Paisleys, which are so named after the city where the textile industry took off. And they had to add extra pews to seat some 1,300 people. So it was the phenomenon of a megachurch pastor was not new to this century or to this continent. He was a popular preacher in his own day. In fact, he was sought after various pulpits and positions. A young Benjamin Rush, who played a pivotal role in 1766 through 68 to convince Witherspoon and his wife, who understandably didn't want to leave her home and make the transatlantic journey to come. Benjamin Rush said he was one of the finest preachers he had ever heard as a young man. Years later, Benjamin Rush would remark that Julia Stockton's admiration for Witherspoon's preaching at Princeton was one of the main reasons he sought to marry her. Isn't that a good reason for marrying someone? As an American, Witherspoon instructed a whole generation of pastors. He drew up many of the foundational documents for the National Presbyterian Church, undoubtedly one of the most respected church leaders. So there's that whole aspect of his life. We're also right to remember him as an American patriot. John Adams famously called him, quote, an animated son of liberty. On May 17, 1776, right here at the Princeton Church, he preached one of the most famous, important sermons in American history, The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men. You can go read it, and it was part of good old-fashioned evangelical, come to Jesus so your sins can be forgiven sermon. And then the second half was why we have a right to resist and to be independent from Mother England and from the UK. Most famously, later that summer, he etched his name into history, the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. In the coming years, he then marshaled all of his energies toward the cause of revolution, which is really remarkable considering he came from the United Kingdom in 1768. So just 8 years later, now he's at the very forefront of this revolutionary cause. One famous quip by the politician Horace Walpole remarked, "Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." Likewise, in a 1779 letter from Adam Ferguson to Alexander Carlyle. Now, this is back in Scotland. These were actually both classmates of Witherspoon's at the University of Edinburgh. Ferguson wrote, "We have 1,200 miles of territory at length in America, occupied by about 3 million people, of which there are about 1.5 million with Johnny Witherspoons at their head." It is hard to exaggerate Witherspoon's influence, though he is much more forgotten, as one of our most quintessential founders. He was well respected, sought after for advice by the likes of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, Franklin. Famously, James Madison not only went to Princeton, he stayed an extra year that he might study under Witherspoon's personal instruction. Besides the Declaration, Witherspoon signed the Articles of Confederation. He helped New Jersey ratify the Constitution. He served in the state legislature. He participated in 126 committees during his 6 years in the Continental Congress. I can say this because I'm a Presbyterian pastor, that you knew he was a Presbyterian because he served on so many committees. That's just the way Presbyterians do things. A list of his Princeton delegates, you've come across perhaps this famous list, includes 12 members of the Continental Congress, 5 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, 1 president, Madison, 1 vice president, Aaron Burr, 49 representatives, 28 senators, 3 Supreme Court justices, 8 district judges, 1 secretary of state, 3 attorneys general, 2 foreign ministers. So we remember him as a pastor, remember him as a founding father, and of course we are right to remember Witherspoon as a successful college president, coming here, immigrating in 1768, and it wasn't lost on people that it was 100 years later, in 1868, that James McCosh, and I know you have buildings and streets named after him here, he came 100-year anniversary of Witherspoon to come. And in fact, I'm sure you know your Princeton trivia that the first president at Princeton who was not a Presbyterian minister was Woodrow Wilson. But his father was a Presbyterian minister, and just to connect dots, Wilson's father is buried at First Presbyterian Church in Columbia, where for a time Thornwell, who was just mentioned, was a pastor. So Wilson comes from Southern Presbyterian roots. It was not at all certain when Witherspoon came to the College of New Jersey, as it was known then, that it would even survive. The previous presidents, though very well respected and august men in their own right, they had one very unfortunate habit, and that was they died very soon after taking office. So when Witherspoon came, though today we think Princeton, it was primitive backwater, especially compared to the booming city of Paisley and Glasgow, to come from the great Scottish universities to this small, barely surviving College of New Jersey. Witherspoon was responsible for virtually everything: recruiting students, disciplining students, boarding them sometimes. He was charged with raising funds, furnishing the library, doing private tutoring, teaching regular courses on history, eloquence, divinity, moral philosophy. He earned the reputation as a man of great energy, a fine teacher, a firm disciplinarian. His leadership meant that Princeton would survive and be established as one of the most important institutions in the new republic. Earlier this year, I was speaking, and I was in Colorado, and I had one night, and I was walking downtown Colorado Springs. It was very cold, so I was going from building to building, and I went into this lovely bookstore and went into the history section, and they had some used books there, and there was a great kind of coffee table book with lots of photos and timeline called The First 250 Years, Princeton University. Maybe some of you have seen it. Don Oberdorfer, published in 1995. And it has about 15 chapters. And one of the chapters is entitled The Witherspoon Era, which tells you something about the significance of Witherspoon in the history of Princeton. In fact, just a little bit, when I got this big book, I have it at my study at home, I opened up the front, and it had a personal inscription to William K. Coors, class of 39 or something, from Golden, Colorado. And it had a typed up note that said, in thankful gratitude for your generosity to the university. I don't know what it says about that it was in the used bookstore by the time I got it for $9, but I have Mr. Corr's copy of the book. The book records, quote, Witherspoon set the course for the future Princeton University to a remarkable degree. He was, by all accounts, Princeton's first great president. Now, there's lots of stories and vignettes. I'm not the world's expert, but I may have the largest store of useless anecdotes about John Witherspoon that I wish I had time to share. Like, for example, when he was a young minister, he got too close to the Battle of Falkirk in 1746, and he, with a few others, were imprisoned in Castle Doone for 2 or 3 weeks. And some tried to tie bed sheets. They actually did that to go out, and when Witherspoon saw that the sheet broke and someone fell to their death, and he was a bit of a heavier man, he decided to forego any heroics. Many of you have seen the Doone Castle before because it's where most of the castle footage is shot for Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So when you watch that, you can say, that's where John Witherspoon was imprisoned. He was a very effective satirist. He had a biting sense of humor that endeared him to his friends and allies and often infuriated his enemies. He had a family life filled with much joy and also sadness. In 1748, he married Elizabeth Montgomery. Together they had 10 children. Though Witherspoon lived long enough to go blind, lose his first wife, and see 7 of his children die, including one fighting at the Battle of Germantown in the Revolution. His daughter in 1784, who died, who had recently been wed and then recently was a mother, he received the news on Christmas Day that his grown daughter had died. And this is really remarkable. Following that, he preached in the Princeton church 16 consecutive sermons on one passage of Scripture. Jesus' words, not my will, but thine be done. You can hear him trying to work out without even mentioning his own grief, trying to come to terms with what had happened in his life. Witherspoon was a real flesh and blood man who lived a life with triumph, disappointment, pain, failure, success. And he also left a profound mark on this country, on the Presbyterian Church, and upon this great university. The question then that must be asked is whether these accomplishments, and to what degree they should be rendered suspect or at least moot because of the issue of slavery. On the one hand, and I anticipate you'll hear this from other speakers, there is much in what Witherspoon said and did that would commend him to us as being on the right side of the slavery question, as we would see it. For example, while a pastor in Scotland, he baptized a runaway slave that likely belonged to one of the leading members of his church. He perhaps risked something of his own reputation to do so. Later at Princeton, Witherspoon gladly taught free blacks. His stated opinions in writings and lectures were uniformly against slavery. He voices objections to mistreating slaves. He urged masters to instruct their slaves, equip them for future freedom. Perhaps the best statement that I think gives the fullest expression of Witherspoon's views on slavery come from the Presbyterian Church's statement in 1787. It's 3 paragraphs long. It's worth reading, but I'll just give to you the conclusion. The recommendation from the Presbyterian Church in 1787 that all people under the care of the church ought to use the most prudent measures consistent with the interest in the state of civil society in parts where they live to procure eventually the final abolition of slavery in America. Witherspoon did not often speak on slavery. When he did, his views were similar to other leading men of that generation in the North and sometimes in the Upper South. Namely, slavery is wrong. It will soon die out, which of course proved to be not the case. Immediate abolition is not feasible, but final abolition should be sought for, and therefore slaves should be prepared for their eventual freedom. On the whole, not heroic, but in what he said, more good than bad. Except, of course, that John Witherspoon owned slaves, or at least in some sense of that term, which we'll come to now. The argument is often made that no matter what sentiments Witherspoon might have expressed against slavery, in practice, he was another hypocritical, self-serving slave owner. Moreover, sometimes in prosecuting the case against Witherspoon, the case is made, often more rhetorically, that Witherspoon, therefore, was complicit in the full weight of the slave system, and therefore, to remember or commemorate Witherspoon is to turn a blind eye to 400 years of oppression and white supremacy. We can think of it perhaps as the one slave rule, to have owned a slave in any period of time without full renunciation and explanation and expiation is to put one's character and accomplishments beyond the pale. But I want us to look more carefully at the historical record related to Witherspoon in slavery, because there is more there than simply putting upon him the scarlet S. There are two pieces of evidence that indicate Witherspoon owned slaves, or at least in some sense. I have copies. This is the last will and inventory of his possessions, and this is a copy obviously, but this is held right here, Firestone Library. And then these are copies of the New Jersey tax ratables from the 1780s and the 1790s. Let me say something about each of these and what they say about Witherspoon's relationship to slavery. Start with the tax ratables. The New Jersey Archives holds the tax ratables for colonial and early national New Jersey. They're records about property, other goods, taxes levied on possessions. And here's what we find for the western precinct of Somerset County. So in 1779, Witherspoon moved about a mile or so off of campus to this country home, Tusculum, and that's when he first has a record of owning a slave. The first record comes in 1780, which makes sense because he moved out to this 500-acre estate outside of town. We don't know how this slave came to be listed under his ownership. We don't have a bill of sale that I'm aware of. We don't know if the college provided it for him. We don't know if the slave was already there on the land and then he purchased it. The person was likely a household servant who helped in the home or on the land of a 500-acre estate, one of the largest land holdings in the precinct. Plainly, Witherspoon did not think of his sprawling estate as some sort of slave plantation, but there was a record of a slave. The next tax ratable we find is from 1784. So 81, 82, 83 are missing. In 84, he's listed with 2 slaves. In 1785, 2. 1786, 2. The next tax ratable, 1787, only has 2 pages, doesn't have Witherspoon's name, so we don't know. 1788, and now, in 1788, there are no slaves. No slaves mentioned in connection with Witherspoon's property, which by this time is 556 acres. And for the remainder of his life, 1789, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, there are no slaves mentioned in the tax ratable. And in 1795, now the estate has gone to his wife, his second wife, Ann Witherspoon. Again, no slaves mentioned. So, assuming 81, 82, 83, that we don't have record for, that he had a slave, it means he had 1 or 2 slaves for 7 or 8 years. We don't know how they got there. We don't know what happened after 1786 or 87. We don't know, did Witherspoon set them free? Did the college set them free? We don't know. But there is something else we need to look at the tax ratables that I've not found mentioned before. And that is that in 1792, 1793, and 1794, there is listed for the first time another Witherspoon. So often Wotherspoon or Weatherspoon is always spelled in different ways. But now there is a Witherspoon in 1792 with the designation N, and then in 93, N-E, and then in 94, N-E-G, this being the designation for Negro. The person marked Negro in the tax ratables, and there's several, not many, but several, they always share the last name with another landowner. So these are almost certainly servants, slaves, and perhaps those who had been recently given their freedom or in some in-between place that were on their way to full emancipation. Indeed, this African-American Witherspoon, and the first name is hard to make out and it's spelled differently, but it's something like Fortin. So Fortin, He's actually listed as a household and as owning cattle. We'll come back to him in a moment and try to understand what that piece of evidence might mean, that 92, 93, 94, there's a Negro, Fortin Witherspoon. That's one piece of evidence, the tax ratables. The second, the tax ratables, is the last will and testament, drawn up on September 15, 1794, modified on November 11. It's important to realize the last will and testament itself mentions no slaves. So drawn up by Witherspoon and his lawyers, it just states who's to receive the final settlement of his property and to his wife and to some of his kids or to the college. The mention of slavery is not in Witherspoon's writing of his will and testament, but rather after his death when two appraisers list out all of his property. The final line of the appraised list, you can see it lists at 200 pounds, so you can see what he owned. It's got one page, here's the second page. It says the very last one, at 200 pounds, 2 slaves supposed to be worth until they are 28 years of age. Now hold that in your mind, 28 years of age, because that's important. We can't be certain how to reconcile that the appraisers say he has 2 slaves, but the tax ratables say at his death he has no slaves. The key, I think, to connecting the two is this curious reference to 28 years of age. Why did the appraisers say until 28 years of age? In the summer of 1791, Witherspoon, his first wife Elizabeth died in 89. Witherspoon married Ann Dill. Ann Dill, Witherspoon was 68. She was, you're not going to like this, 24. It was scandalous even then. And when people objected to it, he said, I don't give any advice and I don't take any either. So he just took it. When they came, the students lit candles and celebrated this new marriage. The Dills come from York County, Pennsylvania. You can read the history of York County. 1886 indicates this Dill. They're one of the leading families in York County, and the family owned slaves. This Fortin, this Black Witherspoon, who suddenly appears in the tax ratables in 1792, most likely was a slave or 2 slaves that came in the marriage to Ann Dill in 1791. And, again, I know this can't be proven absolutely, but the evidence suggests that they were considered in one sense by the appraisers to be among Witherspoon's possessions, and yet according to the tax ratables, they were listed as in their own household and not as a possession of Witherspoon. The conclusion may not be absolutely foolproof, but I think it is the most reasonable way to square the otherwise conflicting documentary evidence. And this is where 28 years of age helps to connect the dots. In 1790, Witherspoon delivered the report of a committee in the New Jersey legislature, a 3-person committee appointed to consider a pair of abolition petitions. The report offered that the legislature, quote, might pass a law stating, quote, that all slaves born after its passage should become free at a certain age, as, for example, 28. Where is 28 coming from? No doubt it comes from Pennsylvania's famous 1780 Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, the first act abolishing slavery ever adopted by a democratic people. The act declared that children born to enslaved mothers after March 1st, 1780 would be born free and bound to indentured servitude until they reached 28 years of age, at which time they would be released from all service. That was the Pennsylvania statute. That was in Witherspoon's mind as a part of the 3-person committee in 1790, and that's the best explanation for why the appraisers list the value of the slaves until the age of 28. So try to put it together as best we can. If 2 enslaved black persons came to Witherspoon's household as part of Ann's property, it seems that they were treated as free blacks in their own household, and at most were to be kept in some kind of servitude until they were 28 years of age. After all, they came from Pennsylvania. And as it turns out, there is no more record of the Negro Witherspoon after John's death in 1794. He's gone. It seems that these enslaved persons who came with Anne, if indeed that's what happens, likely were treated as free blacks and were set entirely free after Witherspoon's death, even before they had reached age 28. So in conclusion, the historical evidence cautions us against assuming the worst about Witherspoon's slave ownership or imputing to him all the worst evils of the institution. In the light of the 18th century context, the contradictory evidence raises questions about what it even meant for Witherspoon to be listed as a slaveholder. Now, perhaps there is more damning evidence out there, and we ought to be welcome to see whatever can lead us to the facts. We don't know how Witherspoon came to have slaves at Tusculum in 1780. We don't know where they went after 1786. By the same token, there's no record that he dealt in the buying and selling of slaves, including those listed as his property. There's no evidence that he treated his slaves poorly or that he had slaves for more than a 7 or 8 year period in the 1780s. And importantly, as far as Somerset County was concerned, Witherspoon owned no slaves at the time of his death. And it in fact seems likely that Witherspoon practiced what he preached in that Presbyterian statement by making Fortin Witherspoon a householder of his own and giving him the opportunity to be fully emancipated, which appears to have been shortly after Witherspoon's death. Now, in all of this, we certainly still wish that Witherspoon had moved more quickly to free slaves in his own life and had made the case for abolition with more urgency. But my argument is simply that if he does not deserve to be celebrated for his record on slavery, neither does he deserve to be condemned. That his overall record is comparable and indeed better than many of the most celebrated founding fathers. And on balance, his life filled with intellectual, ecclesiastical, political, educational, theological accomplishments, which still reverberate today, outweigh the case for denunciation, which is actually thinner than we might have been led to believe.
So again, we have a bit of time for questions. My first comment would be, I think even John Witherspoon would say, we don't have the ability to judge him so much as his maker does.
Right.
And in that sense, we're more about trying to just figure out who he was. But please, questions from the floor. There's one in the back.
So thank you for that good presentation. The question of indentured servitude is on my mind because this whole aspect of service, servitude, or slavery goes rather unmentioned. I am aware in my own research of David Brearley, who is a signer of the Constitution for New Jersey and Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, first Grand Master Freemasons, much heralded, died in 1790, was also holding a contract for an indentured servant who was also to be released from indentured servitude at age 28. So my question is really, do we know and can we explain a little bit more about the whole aspect of indentured servitude, which whether or not this is being perhaps confused with actual in bondage slavery?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is or if we can know the answer other than to raise it, as you did very, very well there, to say that the terms are used in different ways and sometimes with, I think that's probably how to understand why, according to his appraisers, he says among his inventory are 2 slaves, but according to the tax ratables in New Jersey, he has no slaves. The best explanation I think we can come up with is it's some kind of indentured servitude or some kind of plan whereby these 2 persons were free in one sense and yet were tied to the land. And Witherspoon went blind the last couple of years of his life. May have also been part of their being tethered to his work. So I think it's a fair question to ask, how technical are these definitions?
I can answer a little bit of that question, which is the Pennsylvania law.
Let's get a microphone for you.
The Pennsylvania law in 1780 freed every child born to an enslaved mother at birth, but held that that child would be the indentured
Right.
servant
of the mother's master. It was a little bit shaky on that, but that's basically the law. So if we assume that the inventory said that they would be free at 28, obviously they were under 28.
Right.
That would mean that they, under Pennsylvania law, they would have been indentured servants until 28. Now, what the terms of indentured servitude are, they vary, et cetera, but that's at the key of the whole thing. And so one would imagine, in fact, that if your logic is right, and if the facts are right, that's exactly what they were under Pennsylvania law. And then to be freed wholly after age 28, but maybe they were freed even before that because of Witherspoon's
Because
death.
his new wife is coming from Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
Married in 1791. This new Witherspoon shows up in 1792. So if there's another way to connect all those dots, I don't know of it.
I mean, it's worth saying that people who are looking at British abolition, where there was a transition away from enslavement in the Caribbean as a way of, getting a labor force for plantations, toward indentured servitude, often many imported from South Asia, are looking more at a spectrum of coerced to free labor because there's so much overlap legally and in other ways between these terms. I saw a question here and then, okay, go ahead. Sorry, you have the mic. Yeah.
Okay. Your statement leads into my question, and that is, what do we know, what do we understand about Witherspoon's relationship with the British anti-Atlantic slave trade, John Newton, and the famous William Wilberforce? What did he know about them?
Right.
What did they think of our John Witherspoon?
So again, we don't want to overstate the case, and yet it is at least suggestive that under Witherspoon, Princeton gives an honorary degree to John Newton. So John Newton, author of Amazing Grace, the famous, worked on a slave ship, becomes an evangelical minister. Later, John Newton would say that Witherspoon's theological treatise on regeneration was the best thing he'd ever read on the topic. William Wilberforce, so we're getting into past the time of Witherspoon's death, but later in the beginning part of the 19th century, Wilberforce will write a foreword, a preface for a collection of Witherspoon's books on justification and regeneration, and say how highly commended they are. And Wilberforce is an evangelical Christian, and he said he passes out Witherspoon's. So it would be too much to say, well, therefore, obviously he agreed with Wilberforce, but at least does suggest and show how some of those transatlantic connections among evangelicals in particular looked favorably upon Witherspoon.
Great. Question over here.
Thank you for bringing so much of the historical evidence into focus. I'm just wondering, you alluded to a context of whether we should be condemning Witherspoon, but I'm not sure what to make of that, because I'm not aware of any proposal the university is considering to condemn Witherspoon.
I'll take Dr. Krager's friendly amendment to stay away from that particular line of questioning.
I mean, I'm hesitant to pass judgment or not pass judgment. Eventually somebody ought to decide whether the statue stays where it is.
Right.
But today's really about trying to find out more about him. Yeah, there's no plans by the committee of naming to condemn him, or to exonerate him, his person.
You talked at length about the two slaves at Tusculum, but wasn't there also a previous slave when he lived in the president's house on campus? And what can you say about that?
I've not come across that evidence. So Lisa.
I can just speak to both of those things. I think just sort of like when I was doing this research, a lot of university records will say that he had there was an enslaved person attached to Witherspoon at the president's house, but you are correct. There are no records besides sort of what has been written many, many years after the fact for that particular piece
helpful.
of evidence.
And that certainly wasn't out of keeping with staffing at the president's house, as we might put it. Yeah, I mean, there's a long record of enslaved people working for the president. Stacey.
Hi, so please forgive me, right, because I'm not a historian at all. But I just wanted to make sure I understood your argument. So the argument is that there are these two individuals who are of African descent who are living in his home, and because they're not listed as slaves, they must have been freed. Is that and living as indentured servants, perhaps? Is that the argument?
Well, it's more than that. So the two here in 1792, 93, and 94 are listed as a separate household. The Fortin Witherspoon is listed as a householder. So it's a separate line on the New Jersey tax ratables. So there's obviously some connection, because whenever you have someone designated here with the N or the NEG, the same last name as someone else. So there's some connection, but at least as they're levying taxes, they considered this Fortin Witherspoon, who owned cattle, his own householder, not to be, because the slave column says is blank.
Got it.
That's what the tax ratable says.
And so I guess I'm trying to figure out if what this is about is a semantic difference. So if these two individuals who were born into slavery but under Pennsylvania law were now to be freed at 28, but were serving, being indentured basically for the price of their lives as they were born into a system of slavery, they moved to New Jersey, and he doesn't pay taxes on them, but effectively they're still indentured, working for him for no pay due to the circumstances in which they were born. So maybe technically they weren't slaves, but it still feels like they are functionally slaves. And so is that?
Sure.
Okay.
That may very well be the case, that as indentured servants, if the hypothesis is true, yes, they may not have had any choice in coming there. They may not have had any choice in whether they wanted to serve or not. So it's not to, you said, it's not to exonerate Witherspoon or to write away what the record says, but to simply say that it's more complicated, and if the 28 is owing to Pennsylvania law, at least there is the mindset that emancipation is coming, and it seems to be after he died. So it's not to ameliorate the experience that the two persons might have had, but to say that it's a bit more nuanced than just saying Witherspoon had slaves.
One more question from the back, and then we probably need to move on to keep time.
So I think what we're saying is there's a distinction really without a difference. It was all coercive labor. And do we have any evidence that to whether they were actually emancipated, the two individuals we were speaking about?
Well, the record is that 1795, they're no longer he's no longer listed in Somerset County. So he wasn't there. He went somewhere. So that's would suggest to me that they were emancipated and set free. But there could be other explanations.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Helen.